Have you ever heard of a philosophical concept called eternal return? No. It has nothing to do with the 90s sci-fi classic starring Dennis Quaid, and it is not some weird time travel plot device. At its most basic, eternal return is the idea that everything happens in an endless cycle. Time is circular rather than linear, and all events are doomed to repeat themselves over and over for all eternity. This concept has been around since the ancient Greeks, but one thinker who really ran with it was 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and his version of eternal return is actually pretty different from other versions. So here's philosophy explained. Eternal return. Nietzsche developed his ideas about eternal return in the late 1880s and published them in Twilight of the Idols, and then later more extensively in The Gay Science. By this point, Nietzsche had already published several books that had made him something of a controversial figure. His ideas about the nature of morality, his criticisms of religion, and his declaration that God was dead had scandalized many readers, and unfortunately, they would only become more scandalous after his death. Eternal return was one of the central concepts in his final, even more radical mature period, and it definitely wasn't for lack of trying. He tried to live by it. As the story goes, Nietzsche was having lunch one day when he suddenly leapt up from his table, knocking over his glass of wine, and shouted, "I have just had an idea which would justify the existence of the whole universe." Then he sat back down and calmly finished his meal. What was this crazy idea? Well, what if the entire universe, with everything in it, were to just rewind and start again exactly as it was at any given moment? What if the past and future were completely identical? That is what Nietzsche meant by eternal return. Now, Nietzsche didn't mean it in the sense of an actual physical rewind. There was no cosmic tape to go back and listen to Pink Floyd's The Endless River one more time. Nietzsche's eternal return was a way of thinking about the nature of reality. The key thing is that there are no new events. Everything that happened, is happening, or will happen as part of an eternal cycle. In theory, it could go on forever. But for the sake of argument, we can imagine it starting at a particular point, say, with the Big Bang. After that, everything unfolds exactly as before, right down to the very last atom. Eventually, the Big Bang happens again, and again, and again. But Nietzsche's eternal return is not just a general metaphysical theory. He wanted to use it as a lens through which to view human life. So what does eternal return tell us about how we ought to live? Well, according to Nietzsche, we should try to live in such a way that if the universe were to repeat itself over and over, we would not only not be bored by our own lives, but we would actually want to live them again and again. If we found ourselves living the exact same day over and over, like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, but without the wacky side plots and cute animal videos, we would not be annoyed, frustrated, or desperate to escape. Instead, we would embrace it and shout, "Yeah, I'd do that again." In order to do that, though, we need to stop worrying about the future, because the future is just a repetition of the present, and we need to stop regretting the past, because the past is also just a repetition of the present. All that matters is now. And so the first step to living the eternal recurrence is to stop wasting time wishing we were somewhere else. But it's not as simple as just being present in the moment. We also need to be affirmatively engaged with life. Nietzsche tells us to love our fate and to be in love with life in every one of its impulses. To live the eternal return, we need to enthusiastically embrace every experience, good and bad, as something to be repeated over and over for all eternity. So eternal return is a kind of radical acceptance of reality, but it's also a rejection of our tendency to think of time as linear. In Western philosophy, this idea that time moves in one direction has been linked to the idea that there is a purpose to life. For example, in Christian theology, the creation of the world is the beginning of a process that will culminate in the end times and the final judgment. But Nietzsche thought this kind of teleological view of time was misguided. We can't simply assume that there is some goal or purpose to life. Rather, we must accept that the only law of the universe is the eternal recurrence. Everything that has happened, is happening, or will happen is simply a meaningless event in an infinite series of meaningless events. So if we want to find value and meaning in our lives, we have to make it. According to Nietzsche, most people avoid doing that because they are afraid of facing the implications of the eternal recurrence. Because if the only thing separating us from being a mindless plant or a rock is our consciousness of ourselves as unique individuals who are moving through time towards some unknown future, then who are we kidding? Life is meaningless. The universe doesn't care about us and we are going to die. Of course, these are all things that humans have always known, and it's certainly possible to live a meaningful life despite those facts. But for most people, The possibility of eternal recurrence is too much to bear. So instead, they deceive themselves by adopting a kind of false perspective. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche describes this as a kind of self-imposed forgetting. Most people forget that the only perspective from which we can view the world is our own. They imagine that there is some objective, God's eye view that we could adopt instead, where we would see that our individual lives have some special place in the grand scheme of things. But this is an illusion. As Nietzsche says, if we are moved to tears at the mere thought of a vanished 18th century, an extinct race of men, how much more deeply ought we to be affected by the thought of our own finitude, our own passing away, our own personal needy, our own nothingness? The only proper response to the fact of our own nothingness is to affirm it, to say yes to life in all its absurdity, including our own absurd finitude. And yet that isn't the only reaction to this realization that Nietzsche explores. The person who realizes the truth of the eternal recurrence and rejects the comforting lies of the herd mentality might also react with a kind of desperate nihilism. These are the ones who hear the hammer blow of "become what you are" and smash their own foundations. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche warns against reacting to this insight with nihilism. Instead of throwing ourselves into the abyss of nothingness, we should affirm life and welcome the eternal return. It takes strength to face the absurd reality of our existence and still choose to affirm it. But Nietzsche thought that this is the only kind of strength worth cultivating. However, another reason that people are afraid to embrace the eternal return is that it seems to imply that we have no free will. If everything is caught in an infinite cycle of repetitions, then what room is left for individual choice? How can we be said to choose anything if that thing is already chosen for us by the eternal recurrence? Well, Nietzsche was well aware of this seeming paradox, and he thought that it was only an apparent paradox. If we take seriously his doctrine of perspectivism, which says that there is no single correct way of viewing the world, then we can still legitimately adopt the perspective of the eternal recurrence while also maintaining that perspective is merely one among many equally valid ways of looking at things. From the perspective of the eternal recurrence, we are indeed free to choose whatever we want, because whatever we choose will simply get repeated over and over anyway. So Nietzsche's eternal return is a philosophy for people who refuse to lie to themselves about the nature of reality. It calls us to reject the comforting but false illusions that we often rely on, and it calls us to affirm our lives in the face of our own absurdity. It doesn't provide easy answers, but perhaps that's part of why it's so appealing. When confronted with the crushing weight of existence, one can either submit to the futility of it all or one can choose to affirm life, in spite of its futility. Nietzsche thought that we should choose the latter option, not because life has any inherent value or meaning, but because we are capable of giving it value and meaning. It's not the strongest, the cleverest, or the luckiest who are happy, but those who say yes to life in all its circumstances. For more on what Nietzsche thought about happiness, check out this episode. Thanks for watching.